first news topic of the week isn't really a news topic as such, more a discussion point we wanted to cover, because there's been a range of games recently that, well, let's just say they've launched and indeed been updated to basically curious results. We've had games like Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. We've had the Starfield DLC. Dragon's Dogma 2 just received a new update. Typically, if you want to have decent performance on those games on consoles and even PC to a certain extent, you've got to have a new HDMI 2.1 display, and it's got to support VRR. And the question is this, I mean, just how crucial is VRR? I mean, the topic point here says, is VRR becoming a crutch for current generation consoles? And John, you've kind of like accepted that you can now play Dragon's Dogma 2 on consoles, but only because of VRR. What do you make of this?
I'm going to answer the question bluntly by saying no, it has not become a crutch. And I say that because I think most games are actually quite okay. And if you look at the full range of games, both indie and AAA alike, most of them actually run really well. And we haven't had performance this stable in the console space in a long, long time. So I think by and large, consoles are doing very well in terms of overall performance. But there are high profile titles where this is an issue. And the thing is, though, is we've always had titles like this, and they're actually not as bad as they used to be, I would say. And now VRR is essentially sort of a way to overcome some of those issues from the user side, because we've always had games where the developer's unable to hit their performance target, right? That's nothing new. But now with VRR, we actually have a way to solve that in the console space, which, you know, on the PC, there's always ways to solve this, but on consoles, you were usually locked. If a game was going to run at 40 FPS with like unstable whatever, there's nothing you can do about it. Right? Most of the time. Now there is. And that's basically what VRR represents for console gaming, which is why I think it's a really good option. That said, it's not perfect. It does require, on the PS5 side, the developer needs to implement a proper 120 hertz mode for it to work correctly.
To its best extent.
To its best extent. It still works at 60 hertz, but only down to 48 frames per second, which doesn't help games like Dragon's Dogma or even Elden Ring. It helps a little with Elden Ring, but when you get 120, though, it does essentially solve that. Xbox does not have this problem. It just supports 120 hertz output across the board. So yeah, that's basically the situation we're in, where I think it's helped console gaming a lot, and I think it's a great tool for those that have access to it, but I don't think it's necessarily a crutch. And I think we have plenty of examples where it's not a crutch, where it's been used as like an actual feature. Like you look at the Insomniac titles, right? Or even, I would say Gran Turismo 7 is my favorite example of this, because when they added 120 hertz support, they give you the option between graphics and performance mode. Performance mode drops down to 1080p, but it's just a 100% locked 120 experience, right? The quality mode in 120 hertz mode, however, keeps the res at native 4K, but then it relies on VRR. And in reality, that basically means the game is like 90 to 120 FPS most of the time, pretty much all the time while you're playing, which feels nearly as good as 120 locked, I would argue, with VRR, right? It's very, very smooth, but you get 4 times the resolution. But if you don't have VRR, that mode's going to look kind of, it's okay, but it's a bit jittery, right? Although there aren't that many 120 hertz capable displays that can do 4K that don't have VRR, so it's kind of a weird situation there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it's been a net win for console games. It's not a crutch. It might become a crutch later in the gen. We'll see. But thus far, it's simply solving the typical problems we've always faced in the console space.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting new option that opens up new possibilities. I mean, we've kind of seen that with Starfield, right, which launched capped to 30 frames per second. But, you know, just the sheer diversity of the content meant that there was the ability to run much of the game at a much higher frame rate. It's just that the initial decision was made to cap to 30 simply to provide as much consistency as possible, which has kind of become a hallmark of the way console games work. The idea is that you have a frame rate cap in there to ensure consistent performance no matter what. And games are typically designed to run at that specific performance target with little deviation, whether it's 30 FPS or 60 FPS. Now, I would say that if VRR wasn't a thing, there is a good chance that we probably wouldn't have had that Starfield performance upgrade. That's kind of the feeling I'm getting from it, and they're leaning into it quite heavily. Alex, what do you think about this?
Okay, so there's two things I want to talk about here. Essentially, that, like John, I really agree with the fact that it's been pretty much only a net positive experience having VRR available on console. And I think like the first time we started noticing this was with the Xbox One X back in the day when they added FreeSync support for that system. And for modern titles that are targeting Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5, you are looking at mostly everything running pretty darn well. And for those cases in games where it doesn't reach 60 FPS in some sort of mode, like John recently looked at Stellar Blade, you have the ability to soften those frame times and make them look really smooth on a monitor. For example, like in that game, which in its balanced mode can go down to like 50 FPS or something like that at some point. Well, you don't notice that if you have VRR on. But the second thing I want to talk about is kind of that I would still very much so prefer if developers, when they're developing games, that they don't actually consider VRR as a thing, as a given. Because I still think it's great for those people who don't have a VRR monitor to be kind of the performance target. Because if you don't, and I think we see this in the PC space sometimes, you get people being okay with kind of fluctuating performance. And I actually don't prefer a VRR presentation at the end of the day all the time. Because not every game is designed kind of like Doom Eternal style where all the content runs at like a similar frame time. A lot of games are developed with a lot more varied content with differing frame times depending upon where you're looking, kind of like the Starfield example. And I don't actually like going in one room from 40 FPS into another room at 90 FPS, for example. Yes. And I don't like the way that looks visually. I would, in a case like that, as a PC user, I would change my settings to have a more consistent frame time across the whole experience because my eyes prefer that greatly. I actually really like consistency more than like this variability and the high frame rates in one area and lower in another. So I really prefer if developers wouldn't consider VRR as part of the performance targeting of their game, but instead would look to lock to a certain frame rate. It'll help the users that still don't have VRR monitors a lot, but I also think it helps the VRR experience when it does come into existence because just for consistency's sake, for people like myself. Another thing that I want to talk about here is it's not a crutch, and it can't be a complete crutch anyways because it's still imperfect. VRR, I get messages about this all the time about like OLED dimming and stuff like that with VRR on, which I think happens when there's a greater variability of frame times. Another thing that I see with VRR is that if frame times are different enough between, and I see this myself, like when we test like FSR3, DLSS3, or anything with VRR, we're trying to like evaluate smoothness, or just most recently when we were talking about, Elden Ring, as well as here, Dragon's Dogma 2, where there you can turn on VRR, but it won't necessarily make 100% of the performance like look smooth because the variability between frame times could be, I would say, like around 8 milliseconds or so, 6 milliseconds. Like 8 milliseconds or so, you can pretty much see it with your eye, I always feel, like between the frame, because that would be like a VSync drop on a 120 hertz monitor. And I think in that case, you can notice that there's something like, it just like stop for like a little bit. Or higher, obviously, and in games like Dragon's Dogma 2, where even with VRR, like keeping that 40 to 30 FPS range looking good, But then you get to a town, and the town areas in the game tend to have a larger variability of frame times, even after recent patching. So it's not like 100% there. And I feel like that's another thing where we just shouldn't want to rely on VRR anyway. Rather, we should really want developers to make sure frame times are as consistent as possible, regardless of VRR's existence. Because it can't save the day at the end of the day, which is a video I kind of have been wanting to make for a long time now. It's a matter of just finding the time to do it. But I think in general, VRR is really good. I just want to make sure that when developers are like adding it to games, it's a surplus experience for the user, and not one that they require to get like a really great experience. Kind of like Dragon's Dogma 2, I feel like they still need to tighten up the game a lot without VRR.
There's a lot to unpick there. Let's go back to Stellar Blade, where we had the 3 modes: the quality, the balanced, and the performance. The performance locked at 60. The balanced mode was kind of 50 to 60. So if you've got VRR, I would argue that the variations there are essentially unnoticeable with VRR. But even without VRR, I'd still say it's pretty good. You know, it's not a disaster. It's not as if we're it's kind of like it is an additive. It's just smoothing over the bumps, so to speak, with Stellar Blade. I think it's more the titles that are concerning, like Elden Ring, like Dragon's Dogma, where, you know, I think what's happening is, in the case of Elden Ring, they've got a DRS window that's inappropriate. It's always essentially at lower bounds, which means it's always dropping frames. That's problematic. That says to me that there's a technical design issue there. Where was the project authored? Was it authored for a specific performance target? Because it doesn't look like it. You've got these modes, none of which are actually satisfactory, right? And then you compare and contrast with something like Doom Eternal, which was like built for 60 FPS from the ground upwards. And, you know, there just aren't really any drops. And it uses dynamic resolution scaling as the quote-unquote crutch, which I think, you know, by and large has now become a accepted form of maintaining performance. And it actually works. I think in the case of Dragon's Dogma, it's simply a case that it probably should have launched as a 30 FPS game with a proper 30 FPS cap, which it still doesn't have. So because we don't have that, we're looking for basically a way to get a reasonably consistent performance. And, you know, rather than implement that proper 30 FPS cap, Capcom has essentially added 120 hertz support to the PS5 and then sort of said, have at it with VRR, which is a really interesting approach, because I would suspect there's still a lot of people out there who don't have 120 hertz VRR capable displays, but probably would have quite appreciated a level 30 FPS from day one, or as good, or as close as you can get to it. So, you know, I think it all comes down to initial design decisions, really, about, you know, budgeting the assets and budgeting the art for a particular performance target. And my concern is that, well, we've already seen like a wholesale shift, I'd say, to dynamic resolution scaling to give developers a lot more elasticity in terms of those performance targets. And we're finding that in some scenarios, whether we're CPU limited or we're GPU limited, it's not quite working out. And there, I do think, you know, for best results, VRR is there and should be used, but possibly, you know, it shouldn't be, well, I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but it's certainly preferred, right? Certainly for titles like Dragon's Dogma. On the flip side, though, it is, you know, if it's enabling stuff like the Starfield performance mode, I'd say it's a good thing. If we, you know, if it wasn't for VRR, maybe we wouldn't have had that. So it is a net gain in that regard. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering what the point will be where we've got critical mass with HDMI 2.1, where we can actually, you know, developers will feel comfortable about using that as a feature. I'd be quite concerned about that, to be honest. John, any initial thoughts about, or final thoughts rather, on that?
I mean, I guess it's just, Alex, you mentioned earlier the OLED thing, and it's like a flicker. And I would say for those worried about that, it does tend to only manifest with large frame time variations when displaying darker content. So for instance, if you have a horror game that runs with a very unstable frame rate and you use VRR, you do tend to get that sort of flickery effect, which is not great, especially if the frame rate's unstable. Or even if it's like the Medium, I remember had this problem big time, where if you had VRR enabled, you would end up with a lot of flicker, which was pretty irritating. Beyond that, though, I agree with everything you guys said.
There was an interesting point that you raised last week about Dragon's Dogma with the 30 FPS mode.
Oh, right.
I mean, it's still not working properly. But when you use it in combination with 120 hertz VRR, it seems to be pretty much okay. That's
correct? Yeah, it fixes the cap. Because it is still, I guess it kind of cushions the blow of unstable frame times at that point. And it does produce somehow a genuinely like smooth looking 30 FPS. Well, quote unquote smooth, you know what I mean? It looks consistent, we should say, versus without VRR, where it's just a stuttery, juttery mess, unplayable, I would say. So VRR does fix that. But that sucks, right? Like the fact that that's how you have to do it to get a stable frame rate is just, it's completely absurd. And I'm actually genuinely curious now if there's a problem with RE Engine as far as frame rate limitations are concerned, because I can't think of a single RE Engine game that actually has a 30 FPS cap that's properly implemented.
On current gen
consoles, all of their games target unlocked frame rates or higher frame rates, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Which is cool, but like, I don't think they can. It seems like the 30 FPS cap just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's slightly problematic, isn't
it? They should probably leverage the system API.
It's interesting too, because Empty Framework had good 30 FPS games.
But they also, the games built with Empty Framework were largely designed for 30 FPS.
Okay, so one thing I will say, though, Alex, since you brought PC into the discussion, is I think VRR has been one of the greatest things that's ever happened to the PC space. I mean, I remember being at the original G-Sync presentation in 2013, and, well, that was just remarkable for a number of reasons. First of all, because John Carmack, Tim Sweeney, and Johan Anderson of DICE were in the same room together talking about rendering, which was just astonishing. And it was the first time I've actually spoken to John Carmack. But the point is, going back to G-Sync, it was just like, well, you know, at that point, there was so much segmentation in the GPU market that NVIDIA had GPUs that were like operating within 10% of one another. And my point at that time was, well, what's the point of having that segmentation when VRR is here and, you know, it basically looks very, very similar. Those two cards operating within such a small window of one another would basically look identical. You know, very, very small performance differentials there. But more to the point, the nature of PC gaming and the fact that there's, essentially an infinite combination of components means that it's harder for developers to target a specific budget, you know, for their art, for their graphics, because there's so much hardware there and there's so much choice. So VRR was a huge tool in getting great performance on the PC, and still is, right? Yeah, so obviously different use case scenarios there. On the console side, I just think maybe it is time for people to be considering an upgrade if they don't have this functionality, because it really does help. I mean, the whole HDMI 2.1 feature set is really, really good. And I can understand that maybe people probably don't want or need 4K displays, but really is good. What can I say?
Mm-hmm.